Okay, so welcome everybody to our third Cross-Asia talk lecture today with Mårten Söderblom Saarela. I always switched the family names, so I'm very sorry. As our speaker, the lecture will be about 45 minutes to an hour, and there will be time for Q&A afterwards. So please keep your questions in mind and reserve them for later. Mårten is in historic and late imperial China, working on the cultural, intellectual, and political history of language in China, with a focus on the role Manchu played in the Qing Empire. He received his PhD in Princeton, worked as a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science here in Berlin, and is now an associate research fellow at the Institute of Modern History at the Academia Sinica in Taiwan, which also awarded him 2021 an early career research achievement, research achievement awarding. His book is called The Early Modern Travel of Manchu, a script and its study in East Asia and Europe, and was published in 2020. And we don't have a paper copy, but this is how it looks like on the front in the ebook version. Today, Mårten will be sharing with us his expertise on Manchu philology at the Qianlong court. And with that, I hope I ask you for your full attention for his talk, and welcome Mårten to the podium, please.
Thank you, Dr. Siebert, for that introduction, and thanks to the Staatsbibliothek for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to speak about my research, and also in general for doing so much for sinology in terms of making sources and mostly primary sources accessible to researchers. And I think I should mention perhaps that in my 2020 book that Dr. Siebert showed, there are several illustrations that are scans from the Staatsbibliothek collections, actually. So I'm very grateful and for that I've been able to use these resources for many years. But I'm not gonna, in the interest of time, I'll just go into my talk, which I've titled Manchu Philology at the Qianlong Court. The late 18th century witnessed the flourishing of a brand of precise philological scholarship known as evidential learning in English, or kaozheng xue or kaoju xue in Chinese. Let's see if I can. Yeah. In the hands of Chinese scholars from the lower Yangzi region of China, subjects ranging from classical learning to geography and mathematics were subjected to a heavily textual and historical form of research. The role of the Qing court, headed by the Manchu Qianlong emperor, in the emergence of this kind of scholarship has long been a matter of debate. Some have seen Qing imperial power as an inhibiting factor that pushed research into politically harmless discussions of textual minutiae. By contrast, others have recognized the importance that the Qing court had as a patron of this so-called evidential learning. But whatever the case, the Manchu political leadership remains on the sidelines of an ultimately Chinese project. And in this talk, I want to approach this issue of evidential learning from a new angle. And I will look at a series of research projects that were carried out at the Qianlong court in this period. And in these projects, both the source material, the workflow, and the resulting books were wholly or almost exclusively in Manchu. So that's to say that these books were not in Chinese. At the same time as the Chinese textual heritage was being re-examined by these lower Yangzi luminaries, clerks and officials under the leadership of the emperor and his Manchu grand counselors, they produced 3 scholarly works on the oldest Manchu language documents that existed. the archival documents from the early 17th century that the victorious Qing had brought with them to Beijing. So these were archival documents that were fragmentary and hard to read in parts. These documents were studied from a linguistic point of view and also from a historical point of view. And I think we should understand these Manchu philological studies as products of the textually oriented and historically oriented scholarly trend that we had in this period. So that is to say that I believe that these projects were products of the same scholarly trend as Chinese evidential learning. Now, from what I've just told you, it probably seems like there's like a tension in this story between Chinese and Manchus, where the Chinese are represented by scholars belonging to an extra-palatial academic community in the south, and the Manchus are represented by the imperial court. And this is not really how I want to present things. And I think it's kind of unfortunate that they necessarily appear in this way. Because I don't want to tell a story that's fused by ethnic rivalry or ethnic competition. I think that would produce an inaccurate view of scholarly and elite culture in this period, which after all existed within sort of a shared imperial project in which both Chinese and Manchus had a stake. But that being the case, it would be equally incorrect to say that Manchu and Chinese were irrelevant categories in the period. A very clear indication that these categories did matter to the individuals involved is the attitude of the Qianlong emperor, who very deliberately and very explicitly sought to transform the Manchu people and the Manchu language according to his own ideas of what Manchu was. And an important part of this transformation of the Manchus, or of this protection of the Manchus, as he would say, that this protection involved the weeding out of cultural and linguistic practices that the emperor considered to be Chinese. So that is to say that the emperor clearly saw Manchu and Chinese practices and characteristics as different and as opposed to each other. And it is possible that Chinese scholars kind of also had similar ideas about Manchu and Chinese-ness, but because of the highly politicized character of any discussion of these things, we don't really have much statements that are as explicit as what we see coming from the emperor himself. So that just to say that this Manchu-Chinese opposition that is kind of inherent in this framing of my talk, it's not a complete invention. But the reason that it features so prominently in my talk has less to do with this reality than with the historiography of so-called evidential learning. And this central category in the history of scholarship and history of science in early modern China was, in fact, I think, influenced by a discourse that pitted Manchus against Chinese, even to the extent that a reaction against the Manchu conquest of China was put forth as a reason for the formation of evidential learning, at the same time as Manchu's censorship was considered to have given evidential learning its characteristic scholarly focus. Recent scholarship has started to challenge this narrative, and I will continue to challenge it in this talk. I'm going to begin by briefly talking about the Manchus, the Qing Empire that they formed, and then about this historiography of evidential learning. So the Manchus, they were a people living in what is now northeast China, which was then northeast of China, in the early 17th century. And they spoke a Tungusic language that's completely unrelated to Chinese, but instead was more heavily influenced by Mongolian language and Mongolian culture. And the Manchus even began using a modified version of the Mongolian script to write their own Manchu language. The Manchus, they built a state outside the Chinese border in the first decades of the 17th century. And then when the Ming state that ruled China at that time collapsed under the pressure of internal rebellion, the Manchus took advantage of this situation and invaded China. And they occupied Beijing in 1644 and then consolidated their power over the rest of China in the decades that followed. And then by the second half of the 18th century, so well over 100 years after the Manchu conquest of China, Manchu power seemed very secure. The Manchus had defeated their Western Mongol rivals, and they expanded the empire's borders substantially. And the Qianlong emperor, who ruled famously for 60 years, he had been on the throne since 1735. Qianlong, he used the substantial financial resources at his disposal to pursue a very activist cultural agenda that involved erecting and restoring public buildings, producing art and buying imported art, and sponsoring scholarly projects that yielded books in several languages. And the Chinese language scholarly projects that were undertaken at the Qianlong court, these projects employed Chinese scholars who otherwise would have been without a government job. And through these projects, scholars got access to new historical sources. So the Chinese language scholarship produced by scholars to some extent involved in court-sponsored projects, this work has always been seen as the core of so-called evidential learning, or of kaoju. And this historiographical category of evidential learning is actually quite old. Already in the first half of the 19th century, Chinese writers talked about a group of scholars that they called the Qianjia Xue Pai, or the Qianlong Jia-Qing school, where Jia-Qing is the reign name of Qianlong's successor. And in the 20th century, this group, this Qianjia Xue Pai, was seen as representing what by then became known as evidential learning. And this evidential learning was seen as a brand of Confucian scholarship that focused on the classical Confucian texts from antiquity and applied methods of textual criticism to study these ancient texts. So that's to say that evidential learning was different from the speculative philosophy that had been popular in the preceding Ming period. And in the Ming period, at least this is how the received narrative goes, scholars had used the Confucian classics more as the basis for philosophical reasoning than for sort of careful philological study. So from the early 19th century onward, evidential learning, or Qianjia Xue Pai, or whatever it was called, was seen as a largely Qianlong era phenomenon that was contrasted with scholarship of the Ming dynasty that had preceded the Qing. And in the historiography, the time gap between this textual criticism of the late 18th century and the Ming dynasty was bridged by associating some 17th century early Qing scholars with this Qianlong period evidential learning to make more of a longer history of evidential learning. Because there were a couple of very interesting 17th century scholars who had lived through the collapse of the Ming dynasty and the Manchu invasion. And they had also been very critical of this intellectual climate of the Ming dynasty, which they thought had brought national ruin. And they thought this was frivolous, irresponsible scholarship. And instead they wanted evidence-based research. So these scholars predated Qianlong era evidential learning by more than a century. But the two groups were linked in the historiography, and there are certain commonalities or continuities between them. But what's important for this talk is to point out that by linking the 17th century with the late 18th century, evidential learning appeared profoundly shaped by the Manchu conquest and by Manchu rule over China. The 17th century generation would have turned to evidence-based research as a way to deal with the defeat of the Ming. And the 18th century generation, meanwhile, would on the contrary have been enabled to do their research because of the support of the Manchu court. But at the same time, they would have kept their research squarely focused on philological issues that were of no threat to Manchu power. So, in other words, a political crisis in which the Manchus were the problem would have caused a turn to evidential scholarship, but then Manchu censorship would have prevented that evidential scholarship from expanding into other areas, which, if they would have been allowed, might have led to other unexpected social and technological development. Okay. That's the received wisdom. That's not my opinion. That is what people believed for a long time. Now, recent scholarship has played down the unity of this so-called evidential learning between 17th and the 18th centuries. And instead, the focus had been more only on the late 18th century, so on the Qianlong period, which is also what I'm talking about today. So the Manchu conquest has been removed from the set of factors that led to this emergence of evidential learning. Instead, recent research has focused on the expansion of evidential learning outside the core area of classical Confucian philology, and because we know that this kind of expansion did actually happen, despite its discourse of evidential learning being limited by Manchu censorship. Because since the Confucian classics touch on a wide variety of subjects, and since the dynastic states that had been built around Confucian principles extended through Chinese history into the present, proponents of evidential learning expanded their research to encompass a wide array of ancillary fields. And these fields clearly included geography, medieval and recent history, mathematics, and astronomy. And recent research have paid particular attention to work on mathematics and astronomy, which was clearly linked to European learning in these fields in this period. And this European learning had been brought to China by missionaries. So by focusing on this expansion of evidential learning outside Confucian philosophy and outside Confucian statecraft, recent research has really made the movement look a lot more varied and a lot more innovative than any narrative of sort of Manchu political censorship would have made us believe earlier. So in a sense, we are now at a place where the negative role of the Manchus in the formation of evidential learning has almost been erased. But strangely, the result has not been a new role for the Manchus in our narratives about evidential learning. On the contrary, the Manchus are almost invisible, other than as a source of funds for the various scholarly projects that were carried out at the Qianlong court. And the scholarship of evidential learning remains entirely Chinese in both subject matter and execution, if you would judge by the state of the field. And this is where I want to make my small intervention. And I want to show that research that was based on the philological study of texts, coupled with other kinds of evidence gathering, was not limited to work by Chinese scholars on Chinese sources in this period. Just as evidential learning was more than just Confucian philosophy and statecraft, and included things like mathematics and astronomy, so did evidential learning also include more than Chinese. It included also Manchu philology. For linguistic reasons to some extent, but primarily for political reasons, Manchu evidential learning was carried out apart from Chinese evidential learning, with which we are much more familiar. But if we look carefully, we can certainly see, I think, links and similarities which make this Manchu evidential learning appear more as sort of one end of a continuum of evidential learning, rather than as something completely different from evidential learning. Okay, so after this relatively long historical discussion, I'm going to now delve into these actual products of Manchu philological scholarship. There are three that I will talk about. And the three represent different stages in the study of the old Manchu archive. The first, which you have listed on the screen here, is a book on the graphical forms of the script in the old Manchu archive. The second one is a largely linguistic study of phrases and sentences from the archive. And the third is an annotated re-edition of the entire archive into modern Manchu. And all of these three works are available in the collections of the Staatsbibliothek in facsimile editions. And in order to understand these three works of Manchu philology, we need some understanding of the Old Manchu archive. The Old Manchu archive is made up of documents dating from before the conquest of China in 1644. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that the Manchus had begun building a state located northeast of China in the early 17th century. One important technology on which the Manchus relied for this project of state building was the written Manchu language. Scribes working for the Manchu rulers began to record important events in this archive, and they also, at the same time as they saved other kinds of important documents that passed through their hands, such as like state letters and things like that. So these texts, they were written at a time when the Manchu language had only very recently been committed to writing. And the earliest texts in this archive are basically written in the Mongolian script, but they record Manchu words. And then, over time, changes were made to Manchu spelling and several new letter shapes were introduced. So by the time that they invaded China in 1644, the script looked more or less the way it would look throughout the Qing period. And you can see the script here. This is kind of a kind of modernized Manchu, but it still looks old. But it has some of the features of reformed sort of modernized Manchu, and as opposed to Mongolian. But it was not only the script that made these old documents difficult to read. The documents used words that had, later fell out of use, or they used words from other languages, especially Mongolian. Also, as we can see here, the text of the old documents had been edited, and with parts were crossed out and new things written on the side of the line, or other changes had been made to the page. So here you have they've crossed out a few lines and then they've added something. So reading this becomes a little, it involves an element of interpretation. So as a whole, we can say that this archive was a textual corpus that must have looked quite alien to readers in the mid or late 18th century. But even though this archive was a historical textual corpus, it was still relevant on several occasions in the 18th century. We know that it was consulted to establish the proper noble titles of descendants of individuals who were mentioned in the old archive. And it's possible that the archive was also used when they compiled a shamanic ritual at a young Qianlong emperor's court. They wanted to describe these shamanic practices, and at least some sources say that they used this archive as a source. So the point here is that the archive was inaccessible, but it was still used when it was needed. So the reasons that the scholars all of a sudden in the late Qianlong period decided to subject it to comprehensive philological study cannot just be explained by the fact that at this time all of a sudden it was so difficult to read, so they had to study it. I don't think that's really the case. I think there must have been another intellectual reason that they decided to subject the archive to this kind of study. And I think that reason was, a general interest in philological research both within and outside the court in this period. So that is to say that it was the intellectual climate of evidential learning that contributed to this archive becoming an object of study in the Qianlong era. The first book written entirely in Manchu that studied the old Manchu archive was titled Book of Characters Without Dots and Circles, and then you have the Manchu title beneath there. So the Manchu titles, these dots and circles can also be translated as diacritics. So it is like added signs to the Manchu script. Added dots and circles. Let me just show you actually. If you can bring up this page. Earlier, please. The other side. So there are some dots and circles next to many characters, and they were added as a part of the reform of Manchu. And the old archive did not have it, so they called this first book Book of Characters Without Dots and Circles. And this book is a dictionary that matches script forms from the old Manchu archive with the corresponding forms in modern standard Manchu. And it dates from 1741. So that's the date of it, 1741. It was never printed, but several manuscript copies were made. The book carries a preface written by two high Manchu officials, Ortai and Xu Yuanmeng. And in the preface, these two gentlemen said that they compiled the book because the Qianlong Emperor was afraid that knowledge of the old Manchu script would be forgotten if this kind of book was not made and then distributed to the Manchu schools in Beijing that trained nobles and aspiring officials. And if we look at the book, we see that it's quite similar to a very famous ancient Chinese lexicographical work called Shuowenjiezi. And this Shuowenjiezi listed forms of Chinese characters that already, by the time that book was written, in like 100 CE or something, already at that time, they listed forms that were Chinese characters that were old. And then they glossed these older Chinese characters using what was then the modern Chinese script. And this is the same thing is happening in this Manchu book of characters without dots and circles. So here you see a page of Shuowenjiezi, to the left and the Manchu book to the right. And in both books, the old script forms are on top and the modern script forms underneath. So, I mean, I'm not going to read out the Chinese to you, but in some cases it's quite clear which character you have. I mean, you have a character like Fun, and it's written in this strange-looking script, and then beneath it there's the modern form. And then the same thing is actually happening on the Manchu side. So, say a Manchu word like Argadahabi, which is a word there which I pointed to, which the people online might not have seen. It doesn't matter, it's on the bottom left corner. So this word, I think it means to, my dictionary says to outwit or something like that. It's written first in a kind of old orthography with no dots and circles, no dots to the side. And then underneath it is written out in the standard orthography, and they've added diacritics. And the important to note here is that the old script is ambiguous. So it's not clear which dots and circles to add, or if you should add them. So it involves interpretation or some kind of corroboration. So there is like this the result of scholarship that they could make such matches. Point being, these things are quite similar. In the preface to the book, Ortai and Xu Meng, they even describe the functioning of this old Manchu script using a terminology that was strongly associated with Shuowenjiezi. Notably, they refer to the multiple pronunciations that were possible for single old Manchu graphs, so the phenomenon I just described. They refer to this characteristic as an example of, quote, borrowing one graph for another, or jiajie in Chinese. This term was strongly associated with the analysis of the Chinese script that was presented in Shuowenjiezi. Now, the similarities between these two books, Shuowenjiezi and the Book of Characters Without Dots and Circles, I think are quite interesting. First, Shuowenjiezi was a landmark work of Chinese philology. And here we see a Manchu scholarly work being heavily influenced by the structure and analysis in Shuowenjiezi. Second, Shuowenjiezi became a very hot research topic within Chinese evidential learning in the late 18th century. So in other words, the Manchu Book of Characters Without Dots and Circles appears very much in line with scholarly trends in this period, since this too is influenced by Shuowenjiezi. The second Manchu language work that studied the Pre-Conquest Manchu archive was titled The Book of Manchu Phrases Lifted from the Veritable Records. Or you have the Manchu title underneath there. And as this title suggests, this book dealt primarily with the material from the so-called veritable records. And the veritable records were court chronicles that extended back into the pre-conquest period. And you can see a page here. The chronicles were based on earlier materials such as the Old Manchu archive. And in addition, part of this book of phrases from the veritable records, part of the book actually studied the Old Manchu archive directly and not this court chronicle that was based on the Old Manchu archive, even though it had only veritable records in the title. And the book of Manchu phrases lifted from the veritable records was compiled in 3 phases. The first phase began in 1765, and the third and last phase ended in 1776, so over 10 years later than the first. So in 3 disconnected bursts of activity, scholars produced a book that listed phrases from the court chronicles and from the pre-conquest archive, and they listed them largely in the order of appearance in the source text. And then they supplied these phrases with glosses in modern standard Manchu. So in a sense, I think this book appears to represent a progression from the earlier Book of Characters Without Dots and Circles. The Book of Characters Without Dots and Circles was focused on the form of the script. And this new book, by contrast, was focused on the meaning of words and phrases. So we have advanced sort of one step further in the decipherment or in the study of these old texts, from the script to words and sentences. Most of the glosses in the Book of Manchu Phrases lifted from the veritable records explain similes and metaphors. Even very obvious similes and metaphors, actually. And there might be reasons for that, but for purposes of my talk, the most interesting glosses are those that explicitly comment on the linguistic structure of the source text and the difference of the language of the source text with what the editors called like Manchu nowadays or modern Manchu. And in doing so, the book established, sort of defined the language of the early 17th century archive as a historical register of Manchu that it sought to distinguish from the language of the late 18th century. So here you see an example from the text of this book. So this page shows a gloss which the editors point out, in which editor points out that a word in the pre-conquest source text is of Mongolian origin, and then they translate this word into Manchu. So the text that's written in large characters to the left, so this text is read from left to right, written in large characters to the left, that's the quote from the pre-conquest archive, pre-conquest source text. And it says, Bata Ashafi Tai de Horhodoho. Those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words. So it means, you know, the enemy moved. Bata enemy, Ashafi they moved. Tai de, so, and then at the platform or at the outpost, they did something, which is this word Horhodoho, which is the last word. And this last word was the one that the editors felt needed a gloss. So the editors associate this word Horhodoho with what they give as Horhodana. They say this is a Mongolian word, and that they say that it means to take shelter or to hide. And then they provide sort of a slightly wordier paraphrase to the text in the source that sort of explains what it means. So they say like they add a few words to say that the enemy moved and then sheltered and guarded the outpost. And here they have explained this strange word using a Manchu synonym, a Manchu translation. The third and the last work of Manchu philology at the Qianlong court was also the most substantial. Between 1774 and 1780, a large team of officials and clerks produced a re-edition of the pre-conquest archive itself. In total, 134 people worked on this project. And the result was that the original archive, which consisted of partially ordered, partially fragmentary material, of which some sections existed in several versions that had represented sort of different stages of editing. This old kind of messy archive was all rewritten into what was largely a chronicle that informed and resembled the other court chronicles. So it kind of looked like a veritable records. And the result of this re-editing was never printed, but it was written up in several manuscripts that were stored in Beijing and in the Manchu's old capital of Shenyang, or Mukden, which was in southern Manchuria. And some of the manuscripts they made reproduced the old spelling of the source text. And some manuscripts featured modernized spelling, so that is to say, spelling that had added these dots and circles. So that's to say that in these dots and circle manuscripts, the old script forms that had already been inventoried and glossed in the book of characters without dots and circles, and in these phrases lifted from the old Manchu archive, this old script was replaced with the corresponding forms in the modern script. And similarly, words that were spelt differently or spelt irregularly in the source text were rewritten in modern spelling. Of these new manuscripts, only the ones in modern spelling have ever been reprinted and studied in any detail. And I will focus on one of these modern spelling manuscripts too. But even the ones in modern script differ among themselves, and not all of them are as interesting for understanding the scholarly nature of this project. The first of the manuscripts to come to light was the one that was held in Mukden, and that was discovered in 1905. And this remains the best known and most studied manuscript to this day. But this manuscript was actually one of the latest ones that they made. So it kind of represents the final product, the final product of this whole project. But it does not really contain much information that help us understand the scholarly methodology used in the project. Another manuscript was found in the so-called Great Depository, the Da Ku, of what had once been the Qing Grand Secretariat in Beijing in the late 1920s. And this copy was reprinted in facsimile a little more than a decade ago. And a copy of this edition is available at the Stadsbibliotek. And what makes this copy unique is that unlike the copy found in Mårten, which contained only the re-edited and rewritten text of the old archive itself, the copy that became known as the Grand Secretariat copy contains numerous sticky notes pasted onto the pages of the book. So the title, Grand Secretariat copy, is retrospective. On the book itself, it just says like archive of the script with dots and circles, which it also says on the Mårten manuscript, but the content is actually different. So here you see an example of the sticky notes. So there are 410 notes in total. So it's quite a substantial number. And the notes contain information relating to obscure points in the original text. And either the notes explain how the editors chose to handle a certain issue, or they explain that they've been unable to resolve a certain issue, even though they had made certain investigations or looked in certain books. And some of the notes are similar to the straightforward glosses in the books of phrases lifted from the veritable records, but others are more detailed and more discursive. And these longer notes reveal that the editors of the rewritten archive used a varied methodology. And the methodology involved, first, making inferences on the basis of the historical context or of the paleography, the sort of material nature of the record itself. Second, the methodology involved the consultation of experts and the use of reports that we can call the results of some kind of field work, field reports sent in from Manchuria. Third, the methodology involved consulting scholarly literature in Manchu and Chinese. So we had then sort of the methodology of looking at the historical context of how documents were written, or the actual material aspect of the document first. Second, consultation of experts and use of fieldwork. And third, use of scholarly literature. The first characteristic of the methodology, so making inferences on this immediate historical context of writing or the materiality of the text, can be seen in notes such as this one. So here, the editors remarked that a passage of text that wasn't really going anywhere in the original archive and really contained obscure cosmological content. They say that this text was probably a partial translation of some Chinese text. So then they look at the text and say this doesn't really fit in the archive. And they say, it seems that a Chinese book was obtained from somewhere and this was translated from it and recorded in Manchu. I don't have the original to show you, but it's very hard to translate, and I had to rely on other scholars' Chinese translations to even make any kind of sense of it. So I think they're probably right in their little note here. And there are other notes that contain more sort of directly paleographical commentary, in which the editors note that part of the original archive had been crossed out and edited, and they use that to infer that maybe part of the text is actually older than other parts and so on. As for the second point, so that is the consultation of experts and field reports, it is represented in notes where the editors say that they've asked someone knowledgeable in Mongolian affairs to clarify certain customs and practices that are mentioned in the old archive. So here, for example, there's a person they quote a person who has helped the editors clarify the practice of offering someone the heel bone of a cow during a ceremonial meal. And they say that offering this heel bone signifies marriage. And we have experts on Mongolian here, so someone might be able to enlighten me on this point, because I'm just translating what they say. I don't know if this is true. But you see here that this note does not refer to a specific word, but to the whole passage. So in the page you have here, there are two notes, right? There's a note to the left, and that refers to the piece of text that's marked in yellow. And then there's the note to the right, which is the one I've been talking about. So that is just, there's no specific word that's marked. It's just sort of talking about this general thing that's going on in the text and try to explain that. And to do that, they had talked to someone who was some expert on Mongolian affairs, they say. So this was consultation of experts. And as for the use of reports commissioned from the authorities in Manchuria, those examples come from discussions of place names mentioned in the original archive. Because we know from other archival sources that a list of place names mentioned in the archive was written up and then sent out to the regional authorities in Manchuria. And in Manchuria, they were asked to gather information on the distance of these places from the respective provincial capital. And then they were supposed to list any changes that had been made through these place names over time. And they should note if there were any noteworthy features of these places, like any ruins or something there, or like, I don't know, important things there. And then we know that maps with this information was sent back to Beijing. And no one, as far as I know, has ever seen these maps, but the documents say that maps were sent back with this. And then, knowing that, we find notes like this one in the archive. Please change the page there. This one. And here the editors they've come across this one word in the archive that's called koi, K-O-I. And then they say that there's in these lists, there's a river called the Koi River. So clearly they're matching the archive with geographical information sent in field reports from Manchuria. So I turn now to the third characteristic, which is the citation of scholarly literature. And the literature that they cite, they include different kinds of books, including local gazetteers, and also older Manchu dictionaries that had been published at court, especially the so-called Mirror of the Manchu Language, which was published more than half a century before they made this book. And then they cite their earlier books, the two that I mentioned, the Book of Characters Without Dots and Circles, and the Book of Phrases Lifted from the Veritable Records. And here you see an example where they have, they explain an obscure word by using the court's Manchu dictionary. And then this word, allows them to explain an obscure passage of the text. It's kind of long, but so the obscure phrase is bolilame ifija gokshi, I think. Yeah, and so it means something like bolilame. We don't know what this is. The problematic word. Bolilame sewed dress, and then they mark this in yellow, and then they add a note. And in the note, they say that, well, they don't find this word, but there is another word in the 50-year-old dictionary that says that a front-facing dragon weaved around the brocades or something you have on the dress here is called a bolin. And then they say bolilame, maybe this is a verb, related to this word bolin. And then they say perhaps they are describing a certain kind of dress with some kind of dragon on the front. Now, the notes and the research that they represent, I think, raise several questions. First, it's not clear who wrote these notes. As I mentioned, well over 100 people worked on the project at one point or another. And we know that the project was headed by two of the most powerful men in the Qing Empire. The first person who headed it was Suhede, and then after Suhede passed away, Agway took over. And these officials, they're better known for their exploits on the battlefield and as scholars. And even like Suhede, I think when they started working on it, he had just returned to Beijing from having suppressed a rebellion in Shandong, and then he's supposed to head this project, which it's hard to reconcile with that, a person of that caliber. And given the many responsibilities that they had, very, very serious matters, it's hard to imagine that they also had all this time to spend on this philology. But on the other hand, we know that the Qianlong emperor himself was involved, at least on some occasions, in this work. Because we know that as they finished these volumes, they were sort of presented to the throne, and Qianlong at least looked at some of them. And there's some sources that show that in one case, they had made a note like that. And they say, oh, we don't know what this word is. And Qianlong said, well, I looked in the dictionary too, and I found this word. Don't you think this is the one? Because they found a slightly different spelling. And then they changed the text. So we know that Qianlong actually solved some problems himself. And, if he could do it, was obviously extremely busy too, maybe Agway and Suhede also had time to actually spend on this project, but it's really hard to tell. But one sign that the actual research was carried out by the numerous staff members working under Suhede and Agway are found in the apparent limits of the research that was undertaken for this project. For example, thanks to very careful research by scholars in the 20th century, so not by me, by others, we know now that some problems that are identified in these notes could have been solved if the editors had consulted early 17th century Chinese documents that were actually also found in the Grand Secretariat Great Depository. And I think that the problem might have been that this rank and file staff of this project, they did not have direct access to the depository. If they needed something, they had to tell Shuhede, and he had to give instructions to the staff of the depository to sort of lend the material, and then the material had to be returned the same evening. So this is a problem of library access. Maybe that can resonate with some people here. So for example, at one point we have a document saying that, and I quote, all the original Manchu memorials on the Grand Founder's victory over the Ming troops of the Four Roots should be brought out from the repository. So this is like, it refers to a battle in 1619. And clearly they're reading about this battle and they think, oh, we need more information. And they request whatever Manchu documents you have there, bring them out. So we knew that they did request this kind of corroborating documentation. But the problem was that the staff could only really request material that they knew existed. They knew somehow that there was something there. If they had been allowed to walk around in the depository themselves and look for material, it's possible that they would have found additional documents that could have prevented mistakes that perhaps they were not even aware of. So they didn't think they'd made a mistake, and then they didn't think to ask for something either. And we know from other people's careful research in the 20th century that there are definitely cases like this, where they make an inference that has been proven wrong because on the basis of some document that they could have found had they gone into the Great Depository. And to me, this suggests that the people who did the research did not have direct access to the depository, so perhaps they were more lower ranked, and they always had to make a request for anything that they wanted. So, despite these short comments related to the division of labor within the research project on the archive, I think that editors made a genuine effort to produce a scholarly, sound, new edition. And researchers who have studied this re-edited archive in detail, they have shown that editors, when they had, in some cases, they had several versions of the same text. They could find re-edited versions in the old archive itself. And in these cases, they tended to go for the oldest version, even though that was the most hard to read. And that suggests to me that they were interested in really getting to the primary source and not like a secondary rendering of it. So that shows the scholarly rigor of the project. Second, there's also very little editorializing or censoring of sensitive passages in this re-edited archive, which contrasts markedly with the Chinese language books on early Manchu history that were published at the Qing court. So they were like published for public consumption, and in there they kept a lot of stuff out, but that's not the case here. And obviously this was because this book was not printed. It was just meant to be read at court or by high officials or princes. So they didn't really have to have such political considerations. So this absence of censorship in this book brings me to the issue that I discussed in the beginning of my talk. That is to say, the Qianlong court's Manchu philology's relationship with the contemporaneous Chinese trend of evidential learning. In terms of chronology, and in terms of subject matter, and scholarly methods, I think, there are clear similarities between these three Manchu language studies and the Chinese scholarship of the period. In both the Manchu and the Chinese case, we are dealing with philological research on historical texts. They were difficult to read because of their alien language, alien script, or fragmentary and confusing physical appearance. And furthermore, the Manchu books clearly borrowed from the genres and from the discourse of Chinese philology, such as in the similarity of the Book of Characters Without Dots and Circles and the Shuwen Jiezi. And moreover, the Manchu books, especially the very elaborate rewriting of the entire archive and the addition of 410 notes, that used a methodology that involved linguistic analysis and consultation of historical sources and also of other relevant scholarly literature. But it also involved fieldwork in the sense of consulting experts on Mongolian language and customs, as well as commissioning geographical information from the regional governments in Manchuria. And this varied methodology is reminiscent of Chinese evidential learning, which was also largely text-based, but also made use of other kinds of observation in order to fill in the gaps in cases where the text itself was not enough. But I cannot deny that these Manchu projects stand apart from contemporary Chinese scholarship in that they were carried out without any apparent connection to contemporary Chinese scholarship or without any involvement of prominent Chinese scholars who worked on these other more famous court-sponsored Chinese projects of the period. Of these three Manchu books, only the book of phrases lifted from the veritable records was ever printed. And that book was primarily made available to Manchu officials. I think it was printed in like 80 copies or something. So it's not like maybe it's not like my book actually, yeah. And it's quite interesting that this book was printed, but the source material on which it was based, so the court chronicles and the pre-conquest archive, that was not printed. So even the Manchu readers outside the immediate court milieu, they could only read this book in isolation. So for these readers, it was a collection of glossed words and phrases drawn from a corpus that itself was not accessible to them. The Manchu Court Chronicles and the Pre-Conquest Manchu Archive, in the end, they were internal court documents that the Manchu leadership had no interest in circulating widely. And the highly political nature of the source texts that were used in these three philological projects prevented the projects from being open to the wider scholarly community. So in this sense, the Qianlong Court's Manchu philology remained distinctly separate from Chinese evidential learning, even though it mirrored it so closely in terms of subject matter and research methodology. So I will end my talk here. Thank you for your time. Oh, but I'm so afraid that they will correct my mistakes. And they do sometimes, and they're welcome to, please. Yeah. Sure. I think, yeah, I can't remember. I think it was 130, 140 or something like that. Yeah. 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 Mm. Mm. That's a great question, and in this I rely a lot on this a Chinese scholar named Yan Chongnian. He has done amazing work on this. He has assembled a lot of primary documents, and he has just put them in chronological order and arranged them so it makes research very easy. And he came up with this number, and it's exactly as you say that they didn't work on it at the same time. They worked in periods. So some people worked for a while, and then had to do other things and so on. And that is a good point. I can make more of that, because it also, if there's less continuity, perhaps there's also less knowledge of the source text used. For example, if some people just step in for a limited period of time doing some work, maybe they don't really understand what's going on. So that's a very good point. And should be possible to trace, because, well, he got the names from various archival documents, and they usually have dates, so we can trace. And also we have not on these volumes, I think, but some of the other volumes without these dots and circles. They have not been published, but some scholars who have looked at them say that on the covers, I think there are lists of the people who were involved in writing that particular volume. So it might say such and such a person was the copyist, and this person was a proofreader. This person was, they say, translator in some case, which I guess means that they might have been involved with the Mongolian material and so on. So that is an avenue of research that's possible to pursue and worthy of pursuit, but I haven't done much of it on that. Yeah.
two questions. Probably the first one is about the sticky notes, which you referred to. Probably I missed the examples, but are these the kind of the first textual layer actually, or are they that in material, whatever kind of evidence that they were later? And if they were part of the first textual layer, can it be like a possibility like counterparts of what we know now as footnotes, or and also talking about the materiality of these sticky notes is just the color of them, they are yellow. That's a particular role in their position within the text.
Should I do your first question first? Or? Yeah, okay. Also, great question. So I call them sticky notes. I think what's it called in Qing bureaucratic Chinese, they are tiehuang, right, Max? Tiehuang, right? So they also have called huang, yellow in there. And of course, I've only seen this facsimile. So here it's not clear that they are pasted to it there, but they are. Mm. Yeah, if that is like a... Yeah. Well, here it clearly marks that like that's the part that it refers to, and I'm guessing that is also a strip that could be removed, but yeah. So about these questions, first textual layer or later. I mean, this is also a quite great question, which I didn't consider enough. So we know that this volume has it. We know that this volume is not the latest that was made. The one in Mårten is later, and it doesn't have it, and it differs in some details in the content. But it's not like these notes bring out problems that are then resolved in the later version, which could have been one hypothesis on why they were there. Like, we make this first version, but there are some unresolved issues. We put them here, showed it to the emperor, and maybe he can come up with some answers, right? But then we would expect more changes to have been made, which is not the case. Of course, it might have been that they intended more research to be done, and then they didn't have the time or whatever. It's possible. But I don't know. What we do know, though, is that... so I mentioned that the Qianlong emperor made at least one correction himself to this text. And then he says there that, oh, you made this, you have this note saying this and this, but you don't know what's going on. I found out, and this might be the answer. And then he says, why don't you ask Shuhada and see what he says? And then we look at the text in that place, and they've made the correction that Qianlong mentioned in his comment. So then clearly there was a note that was then removed, and the original text was edited, and that note was removed. So it is a product of the work on the archive, and at least in that case, we can date it to a specific time, to this time. So I would not think that they are added much later. I would assume that they are part of that process, but... if they are not, then what I'm saying here is, would have to be seriously revised. But they are from this period. And speaking of footnotes, I mean, the chapter that this is based on, I wrote like in my book manuscript. I think I call it like footnotes to early Manchu history, because I think that they are kind of like footnotes, right? Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. I will take your second question.
The second question is about the comparison of the book with the dot cycle. You showed it. I understood it like there was a real influence on the philology on the second book. But then the second book you mentioned, I forgot the title.
Yeah.
Which also analyzes like phrases and more complex structures. I'm curious about, is there any clear source of Chinese influence on this second book, or vice versa? Could this have influence just like Chinese linguistic scholarship? Because what is known from the history of Chinese linguistics in China, that like new ideas often came from outside, so I'm wondering what this position has also in the history of Chinese linguistics, but that was influenced by Chinese, but it's not influenced only Chinese or all over places.
This is also a great question. I didn't look for specific models, because in the other case, it was this Jia that put me on the track of Shuojiezi. And then I looked at the structure and it's like, actually, it's kind of similar. Also, the first one, it's organized by what I first assume is alphabetical order. And then I thought, okay, it's alphabetically ordered dictionary. But then I realized that actually those Qing scholars, they thought of alphabetical order as script-based order, which is Shuwenjitsu also has for the Chinese script. So then I thought there's a lot of similarities there, so I put that in here. But for this other book, well, it is a glossary to a source text that the reader doesn't have access to. So if I would look, I mean, what I can think of when it comes to this evidential learning, at least, that would be the glosses to classical works that were produced in great numbers. But in those books, the glosses really follow the source text in this double-line commentary, and doesn't look like this. Here it's just like, you know, source text, commentary, and then if you have the other text parallel, you can go between them pretty easily. But without that, you can't. So I'm not sure what I would look for. Maybe Buddhist glossaries? I'm not sure at all. But when it comes to the contents and whether there's Chinese influence on the in other senses, I think at least we can see also here some kind of, to some extent, there is a linguistic vocabulary that's borrowed from Chinese. So at some points they identify, like, I think they say the word for like 虚字 or 整字. They have that in Manchu, those terms. So clearly there's like a conceptual apparatus that seems to be shared with the Chinese discourse. But I should also say that this book was kind of the most disappointing for me to study here of these three, because so many of the glosses were not interesting from my point of view. It's just like if they say like, oh, he's flying like a dragon, they're gonna say this is a metaphor or something. Like, it's like very obvious that it is. So I don't understand why they point it out. And I think maybe it's because it's like a politically very important text and everything has to be very clear. And most glosses are like that. So they're not like, to me, they don't feel so scholarly. And the ones I've dug out here are rare. I mean, there are more than I could discuss in detail in my written version, but still they're not super numerous. So
I also comment on syntactic structure?
indirectly, in this, not with using a lot of technical vocabulary, even though they might have had access to more vocabulary if they had used, for example, the Manchu textbooks that were published privately in this period, so published for personal consumption, and I guess many of these people must have read. There you have more elaborate discussion of Manchu verb forms, for example. Here they will discuss those phenomena, but not really, but mostly by analogy. They will say this word that has a specific ending. Say, okay, you have an ending like Mongol-so means the Mongols. The S-O is like a plural. And then you have Nikasa, the Chinese. The S-A is a plural too. But that's not a productive plural in Manchu in this period. So they will say, but in the old source text, they find another word that has the ending, but it's not lexicalized in their language. So they say, oh, but this word is like Mongoso, it's like Nikasa. It means several of this or whatever. But they never say this is a plural suffix. You know, so there is that kind of morphological, at least, maybe not in syntax, but morphological discussion by analogy. Yeah.
Described quite nicely the new approach that the Manchus developed. It is an obvious question for what you said. What were the influences? One question, maybe the influences came from Chinese thinking, but you mentioned also actually others place. I mean, all Manchu looks much like Mongolian. You also mentioned that there were Mongol experts who were asked in certain questions. And I asked myself if some influences might have come from the, if you like, Central Asian side, from the West, basically. We should not forget that the Mongols had started to translate into their own language the full Tibetan canon, which is the Kanjur and Kanjur. And the Kanjur, at least, the full wealth of Sanskrit grammatical and philological thinking. So my question is, could there have been an influence from that side?
Yeah, I mean, there's also just one great question after the other, and here I again have to confess that I have my own limited perspective on these things, because I also come from this, Chinese history perspective, and that is what I wanted to look at, like Chinese evidential learning and in relation to this. So I look for Chinese things and I find them, you know. But if I would have looked for Mongolian things, perhaps I would have found that too. I just haven't done it because I'm not as comfortable working with Mongolian sources. I don't really have the familiarity with that. But it's certainly a possibility. I mean, they're also translating the Kanji into Manchu at the Qianlong court, making a Manchu version. And these people, that goes back to the other question of the personnel. They're changing back. They're not the same people all the time. Because they are employed by other offices at court. And sometimes they're sent to work on this. Sometimes they're still working on some other project. They might have circulated more widely within these groups that were working on different Manchu projects. It's very possible. In that case, there might be been an influence there. As for the Mongolian experts, we have similar mentions for a project that's kind of half Chinese, half Manchu that I didn't mention, which are the revised glossaries for the dynastic histories of the Yuan, Qin, and Liao. So for the Jurchen, Khitan, and the Mongols, which are like, from, I don't know what it could be, 10th century, 11th, 12th, 13th century, 3 dynasties. And those histories were written in the 13th century, and they have a lot of, they're written in Chinese, but they have a lot of non-Chinese words in Chinese characters in them. And originally they had, 2 of them had some glossaries at the end, where they said, oh, this word is, this word, Jurchen word means this in Chinese, and so on. And Qianlong Emperor, he orders this revised, and it's revised multiple times, taken a long time. And they expand these glossaries a lot, and they want to cover all the non-Chinese words that they find in these sources. And then there too, you know that they are consulting with Mongolian people. In that case, they say it's Mongolian princes who are visiting Beijing because they have to go to court. And then they ask them, like, so we have this strange word in the Yuan dynasty text, what do you call this in your language? They're saying, like, this is a Chinese document, so they say, I think, suwui, so like in your vernacular language. And sometimes they can find out which word it is. Sometimes they say that they didn't know and they had to do other researches. And they invent things. I mean, not invent. They make inferences that we think are not sound. Qianlong Emperor said that the language of the Liao, so what we call the Khitan, he said that was Solon, which is like a Tungusic language. And so he wants to make all of those words Solon. It's hard to make that fit. But there at least we know that the experts are Mongol princes, who were probably educated in their own tradition. And also they are translating this Mongolian historical chronicle called Erdeni Topchi. How do you translate that, Max? The jewel. Yeah. This is like a chronicle that Qianlong also, because they're doing these glossaries, he sends a court letter to Mongol Khalkha prince in Mongolia and saying, do you have any old origins there on the history of Genghis Khan? The name of Genghis Khan appears there, the clan name of Genghis Khan. And then he digs out this chronicle and sends it to the court. And then they start translating that. So then they get the Mongolian primary source from 17th century chronicle back to Beijing. So there is that going on too. And if one would look in that direction, there might be more there. I just have to confess that I didn't do it yet, but thanks for bringing that up.
I mean, actually, in those days, pretty good at philosophy witness, isn't it? I think it was in the 90s of the 18th century that they find language dictionary with much of Mongol, Chinese, and even we could even imagine some Turkish influence coming from the Turkey side.
Yeah, exactly. It goes in all directions. It's very multilingual, this scholarly milieu at court.
Question. Are there thinking of your talk when you presented the broader context, which was really fascinating. You didn't mention, or you seem to say that there were no Manchu officials, to your knowledge, that were involved actually in the Chinese language kaozheng. Or am I going to dive this here down? Were there Manchu officials who were involved in kaozheng projects? My sense is that there were actually.
Yeah, I said that they weren't, and that's probably wrong. It's always dangerous to make such blanket statements. I was just thinking of these scholarly treatments that really sometimes isolate Chinese evidential learning to small group of people around three figures, around Qian Daxin, Dai Zhen, and Hui Dong. And those three, and they're like students and whoever, entourage. And there are clearly no Manchus. These are all people from Jiangnan somewhere. But if you say there were Manchus involved, you might be right. And that would be interesting to look at those individuals. Yeah.
I mean, I was just thinking too, of even the top family, you know, it's worse. Manchu officials.
Yeah.
Manchu proximate officials who sent down to John. It seemed like very aware of what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, one could argue that these people like Shuhedo and Agway were scholars too, if they were involved in these notes or not, I'm not sure. But and then you have in painting for sure, there's a manual on painting from the court, and the author is a Chinese bannerman, I think, or a bondservant or something. So at least in the art production, you have bannermen. So why not also in this scholarship? Yeah, that would be a good paper.
Also, another part of this that, you know, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Manchus or Mongols or better people in general were involved in translating many of the four books. And as they did so, they had to make decisions about interpretation. So, to what extent did they ever consider, or did they ever get dragged into various discussions about that were going on in Chinese about new text and old text? You know, philological questions that really animated the scholars.
Yeah, that is one question to which I do have an answer, because that's one thing I put in this written version as a kind of a prelude, is the translation of the Confucian classics, which is obviously also philological, necessarily a project of interpretation. They have to at least choose which text, which commentary to follow and so on when they make the Manchu version. And in the Qianlong period, there are, and this has been pointed out by some people, Ye Gaoshu has pointed out that in the revised Manchu translations of the Confucian classics that are produced at the Qianlong court, they remove any commentary. And it's just, I think, this text of the classic. And that Professor Ye linked to contemporary trends in Chinese scholarship, which also sought to value the original text over, say, the interpretation of Zhu Xi or something like that, which was associated more with speculative Songming philosophy, Songming Li Xue. So there is like the same sort of tendency to focus on the original as seen in his translation. But I didn't find any kind of real discussion either in Manchu or Chinese about any particulars, you know, so I couldn't really fit that in here. But from the Kangxi period, there are a couple of memorials by this famous scholar called Heshu, Manchu scholar, did many translations in around 1700, around there. And he writes they are translating some kind of philosophical compendium that was never published, but they're translating it as like a Ming, I think, we have the Chinese version, a Ming compendium on like Neo-Confucianism into Manchu, and they are sending Kangxi clearly like their drafts. And Kangxi makes comments. And he says, well, here you translate this word like this, like, but hasn't it also been translated differently in some other book? And he wants it to be unified. And then he also sometimes comments saying that this word has this meaning, but like it also has this other meaning. Or here you have 2 Chinese characters, but you put 4 Manchu words, like why not 2 Manchu words and so on. So there you clearly have some kind of philological discussion. But that's predates these projects. And I don't know if that continued, but we don't have the material from the Qianlong period, or if those discussions were limited to the Kangxi period. But they definitely belong in this story as like an early example of Manchu philology.
Thank everybody, especially Mårten, for your talk and for your questions.
Thank you.